Hello and welcome to this video on why it is that cherry blossoms only last for a few days. The transience of blossoms is what makes them a national and cultural phenomenon in Japan, where the week of flowering is practically a universal phenomena. That same phenomena is, as said, short in duration. While the hanami or cherry blossom viewing can go for up to 6 weeks, the exact time frame in which the trees will flower is generally pretty narrow. So you really only have a few days as an opportunity to see them. There is admittedly a 6-week window in which that can occur, but the exact week or thereabouts it occurs is often hard to predict, and there's actually a surprising amount of research gone into trying to do just that. You might be lucky with conditions, trees, location, and so on that allow them to last a little bit longer, start earlier, and so on, but if you're unlucky, well, they may last a very short time. In fact, as we've experienced, less than a day. And this is when you have poor weather and conditions. More or less your tree flowers, and then you have some severe weather come through and suddenly you have a tree full of leaves and no flowers anymore. To both make the cherry blossoms last as long as possible, or at least not disappear quickly, it's important to understand why they don't last very long. Blossoming occurs every year, but every year, at least over the last 30 or so years, it's occurred a little bit earlier each time. This has been a pretty clear trend, pretty much across the world. Understand, there's been no major deviations, and it seems to be directly derived from the annual change in average temperatures. This is a slightly elevated average temperature, a shorter chilling period, and of course a relatively earlier and somewhat more forceful forcing period. This means that the blooms will occur earlier. They won't be as developed and certainly won't be set up to last for anywhere near as long. Of course, this is not true in every respect across all areas, but it's fairly consistent with some variability across latitude, but otherwise you pretty much see what we're talking about regardless of your location. One of the major things that's going to drive this is the spring period, the warm, that comes just before the flower buds break open. This needs to be just warm enough for them to break open, but not so warm as to shorten their lifespan. But you also need a period of warmth in winter. But if it's too warm, the chill doesn't last long enough for the flower buds to set. On the other hand, that excess cold, or at least delay in getting enough cold, that can cause another issue around blooms being delayed, mostly because it takes them longer to be able to open up and emerge. You need a cold period for all of the flowers to bloom on your cherry blossom. This isn't a non-negotiable, and as such, having it either shortened or having that chill period reduced to a certain point, understand there is a period at which it's too cold and you actually have a negative effect, means that you get diminishing returns the colder it is or the hotter it is outside of that range. You need a relatively narrow period of about 4 to 5 days with reasonable temperatures. So we're talking somewhere around 15 to 20 degrees Celsius, or if you want to use freedom units, somewhere between 60 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit. If the temperature is colder than this, it takes longer than 4 or 5 days, and you do have the upside to this in that although it's colder, theoretically the blossoms will last longer. Or more accurate to say, there are fewer of them that open up at one time, so the entire tree remains in flower for longer, but individual blossoms do not. This is all down to the way the tree undergoes a series of steps. You have to have the initial environmental cues lined up just right. But once you have that happening, what's going to occur on a physiological level, that is what's happening inside the buds and tree, is rather more complicated again, and this is one of those things that's being explored at a scientific level in order to better predict when it is, and to what extent, the cherry blossoms will flower. It's the Japanese idea of going to an extreme. Giant robots, anime girls with weapons, just in general Japan. But the tree thing, the cherry blossom thing, is perhaps more useful. Well, unless you're a weeb, in which case this is not going to be that much interest to you. The things that are going to have an effect are your fat hormones, which are going to be activated by that external temperature stimulus, but they then have an effect on the regulators and the aquaporons within the organelles and the cells within the tree itself. What happens is kind of weird. The genes that get expressed involve transcription factors, phytohormone-related genes, transporters, and cell wall-related genes. And that's because the stress, basically, of the seasonal change on the cell wall. The low temperature starts by causing proteins within the cell wall to become surprisingly soluble, and as such, they have an initial decrease as they're basically released from the cell wall. To compensate for this, the cell, from the tree's point of view, tries to make up for it by increasing production to a significant degree. Now, this is all well and good, mostly down to the fact that the free proteins help to maintain water balance and prevent some of the harmful effects of temperature fluctuation. But the problem is, once those proteins start breaking down to amino acids, they can create a slight problem. They cause a temperature decrease, and the rebound then doesn't really make up for this. That then causes issues to do with more water retention within the cells, and then this creates issues with low temperature damage. And so you end up with the initial response being something that makes a lot of sense. The compensatory mechanisms make sense, but like with a lot of, let's say, solutions nature has come up with, even the human body does this to an extent, it doesn't actually work in the long term. It's the same way that, say, hypertension in humans. It could theoretically be a solution to one thing, but it causes a problem elsewhere. The average minimum temperature is another major factor, and remembering you need a certain amount of minimum temperature for trees to undergo the necessary dormancy and the chill factor to allow for this. But that is going to affect other things than just the proteins. You have MDA content, SOD enzyme activity, and POD enzyme activity in most cherry trees and varieties of cherry trees. This means you end up with things like, say, proline content, that's one of the amino acids, being released out in large quantities. And so when you have free proline, you get cold tolerance being reduced. Now this does theoretically open up an avenue for, say, genetic modification among cherry trees that could theoretically allow for long blossoming varieties to be made in the very distant future. But one of the complexities of this is that osmoregulation. That is the movement of water. Another thing that taking it away would do would actually open up the cherry tree to issues around reactive oxygen species. And so, by removing it as a thing that the tree needs, or at least can release in large quantities, you do create an opportunity for other complications. Beyond proline and the amino acids as a whole, we have the signaling molecules and certain structural elements within the cells, and particularly within the flower bud proper. There are proteins that are, let's say, beneficial in the flower bud, and this is what effectively encouraging the flower bud to open up and go from being a bud to a flower. Now, this may not sound all that exciting or novel, and to an extent it's not, to be true, but what's important here is that the proteins and their utilization will vary, particularly around cold variation. So again, we come back to that idea of the cold affecting things like the cell membrane, and from the cell membrane or cell wall, you get the release of certain proteins that can then promote the flowering process. But again, without the necessary steps before then, so just the right amount of cold, you pretty much find yourself with a Goldilocks scenario. Too cold, you have a problem. Too hot, you have a problem. It needs to be just right. The final thing you need to consider is sugars. That is, particularly sucrose and D-glucose. For the most purposes, you can ignore what D-glucose means other than it's just a form of glucose. We have a whole video dedicated to what that's about in one of our linked videos. What's important here is that the differentiation and the morphological differentiation, that is, going from that flower bud to flower, needs these sugars along with everything else we've mentioned. During the flower bud differentiation process, there is a huge spike in soluble sugar content in the leaves, and in order for some of the sugar to be soluble, you do need an increase in temperature, otherwise it won't be able to flow freely, particularly the way sap works in a lot of these dormant trees. This is one reason why, particularly in parts of the tree where you have flower buds, there is a notable increase in the amount of these sugars present. and it's also why these parts of the tree, the new branches that contain the cherry blossoms, tend to be significantly more plump, and that's down to the fact that the sap is flowing through them. The cambium is much more active. Now, factors that you won't be able to do much about, and we certainly have no real control over, are going to be things like local air temperature and general global temperatures at that time, generally speaking, northern hemisphere, southern hemisphere temperatures. As a result, although yes, your local temperature will have a significant factor, you're going to find that there are other things that you need to consider, mostly down to the fact that you have the radiation coming in, that is the sunlight, and that's going to have another major factor on your tree, particularly how early it blossoms, but also how long the blossom lasts. There is a general indication that the three components you need to worry about in terms of environment are going to be things like the budding and flowering itself, that is, how the sunlight helps the buds set and go, the amount of sunlight, the duration of it, not just the energy imparted, and the, let's say, hemispheric temperature average, that is northern hemisphere, southern hemisphere. The average temperature for that hemisphere at any given time is going to be more predictive of how soon the flowers occur. But again, remembering, the flowers themselves will only last for up to a week. So generally speaking, the higher the average temperature, at least the earlier in the year, or towards the end of winter and into the start of spring, the earlier you'll have flowers. But it also means you'll not have flowers for anywhere near as long because they'll be gone that much sooner. Outside of extreme, let's say, weather conditions, such as extremely high winds like damaging storms, wind is not a major factor in the end. It'll certainly be a factor if you do have extreme weather, but if it's a typical period where that's not something to consider, wind really isn't relevant. Sure, it'll be pretty sights with blossoms blown everywhere, but, well, looking like bloody snow is probably not something that's really all that important. What is important is that it doesn't harm the duration of the flowering. And more so in a lot of urban areas where a build-up would indicate that simply due to the physical barriers of large buildings, cherry blossoms aren't affected anywhere near as much. To an extent, this is how and why cherry blossoms don't last very long. Some of it is certainly the weather, but some of it is the physiology of trees, and some of it is just the way cherry blossoms are until a week or so after the flowers occur. And then there's other things again that come into play. But overall, it's a reasonably complicated scenario, and a lot of it's not necessarily well understood yet. It's why there's so much effort from the Japanese government to understand what's going on with cherry blossoms. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing.